Imagine discovering that the Australian government right now spends more than $54 million every single cycle to actively train its care workforce how to be blind.
Yeah, it sounds impossible when you say it out loud like that.
It really does.
Yeah.
But that is the foundational paradox we are exploring in our deep dive today. We are unpacking this really massive investigation drawn from an essay and its accompanying forensic dossier, which is titled Certificate Third in Forgetting You.
And it's such a critical text to go through.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to look at what happens when the very systems that you and I trust to care for us are structurally designed to look right through us.
Right.
And we want to explore how that omission, that blindness, is maintained by an incredibly complex, highly funded bureaucracy.
Because it is a forensic dismantling of a system that, honestly, most people simply accept as a neutral reality.
Oh, completely. We just assume it's how things are.
Right, but the dossier doesn't just point out a flaw in the Australian care and support workforce. It actually traces the exact funding lines.
The actual money.
Exactly. The money, the governance structures, the curriculum frameworks that manufacture that flaw. It maps how an institutional blind spot is quite literally bought and paid for.
And to really grasp the scale of the bureaucracy you're talking about, I mean, we have to start at the physical human level.
We do.
Because the essay brings us straight into the room during what the author describes as the thinnest moments of a person's life.
That phrase, thinnest moments, is just, it really strikes you.
It hits hard. Because think about dropping off your child at a new daycare for the first time. Or, standing by the bed of an aging parent in a residential care facility.
Yeah, those high-stakes moments.
Right. Or sitting across a really sterile desk with a case manager who holds your family's entire file in their hands. You are at your absolute most vulnerable.
We're handing over control.
Exactly. You are handing over your body, your medication, or your child to someone wearing a lanyard. And you offer them a vital piece of information about yourself. You tell them that you were adopted or that you were separated from your family of origin.
And the expectation there in any clinical or care setting is that disclosing a foundational piece of your history will trigger a corresponding shift in the practitioner's approach.
Which makes sense, right?
Right. I mean, in the medical world, if you tell a doctor you have a history of heart disease, that data point completely changes the trajectory of your care.
It changes everything.
It alters the questions they ask, the procedures they recommend, all of it.
Usually when we talk about a diagnosis or a life event, there's an expectation of precision. It's almost like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows the jagged white line, and the technician points and says, there it is.
The evidence was right there.
Exactly. But when a separated person discloses their severed origin to a care worker, the x-ray machine doesn't just fail to capture the image. It becomes really clear that the technician was explicitly trained never to turn the machine on in the first place.
Wow. Yeah.
There is this particular silence that arises in the room. The care worker's face simply goes blank.
And that blankness is so central to what the essay is dissecting.
It is. And the author makes a really crucial distinction here, pointing out that this isn't cruelty.
Right, because cruelty implies intent.
Exactly. Cruelty would at least be a form of recognition. Cruelty means they see the wound and choose to press on it. But what happens instead is this smooth, trained blankness. They nod, they move their eyes back to the screen, and they just click to the next field in the intake form.
And the visceral reaction to that blankness, the bodily response, is documented in the text as the subsonic hum.
Subsonic hum, yes.
The essay describes feeling this hum start up, kind of under the floor of the conversation.
It's such a hauntingly accurate phrase for lived experience. If you are an adopted person, you know that hum in your bones.
It's an embodied reaction.
It is. It's the immediate sinking realization that the thing at the absolute center of your life, the foundational fact of your severed origin is, to the system standing in front of you, not even a category.
It simply doesn't exist on their paperwork.
No, it doesn't. And the author insists on what they call honest adoption language.
Which is such a vital framing for this deep dive.
It really is.
Yeah.
It means we have to treat the lived experience of being deprived of an origin not as some individual pathology that needs curing,
Right, not a disease.
Exactly, but as foundational expertise. The adopted person in that room is the premier expert on their own continuity and their own loss.
But the system interacts with that expertise as an anomaly.
Or it just treats it as entirely invisible.
And that invisible treatment is really where the systemic analysis of the dossier begins to pull back the curtain.
Because it's not an accident.
Exactly, because
Yeah.
that blankness on the care worker's face is not an individual worker's moral failure.
No, not at all.
The educator in the childhood room, the support worker at the aged care bedside, these are, by and large, incredibly decent people doing brutal, exhausting work.
They are completely overworked.
Yeah. And the text is emphatic that the blankness is not native to the workers themselves. It was installed upstream.
Installed upstream, that is the phrase.
It is a product of policy, it's a product of budget and governance.
So if you are listening to this, whether you are prepping for a policy meeting, or maybe you're working in the care sector yourself, or just fiercely curious about how massive bureaucracies function, the documents we are analyzing today matter deeply to you.
They affect everyone.
They really do. Because these frameworks represent the literal credentials behind the lanyard of the person who will eventually handle your body, your medication, or your family's file.
That's the reality of it.
And the central paradox the dossier identifies is this. Australia spends tens of millions of dollars to train its care workforce, yet produces a curriculum that never teaches them that a person can be deprived of their origin.
And the scope of this training apparatus is just vast. It's hard to overstate.
So break that down for us. What does it look like?
Well, the dossier points directly to the national set of qualifications that defines what a care worker is legally trained to know. And this is called the CHC Community Services Training Package.
Okay, the CHC package.
Right. And this package is the singular source of truth for nearly everyone paid to care in Australia.
When the text refers to the CHC Community Services Training Package, what does that actually mean on the ground? I mean, how does a massive government package translate into a lanyard in a hospice or a daycare center?
It translates through foundational credentials. So the investigation zeroes in on three major qualifications within this package.
Okay, what are the three?
First, there's Certificate of Third in Early Childhood Education and Care.
Which is for daycare workers, preschools, right?
Exactly. And that one carries the specific code CHC 30121.
Got it.
Second, there's Certificate 30 in Aging Support, which is coded CHC 4301 Pi.
So that's the aged care sector.
Right. And third, Certificate Third in Individual Support, CHC 33021.
That's disability and general care.
Yes. Millions of workers across the country hold these specific pieces of paper. I mean, these qualifications cover the entirety of the care sector. We're talking childcare, aged care, disability, youth work, child protection, case management, family support, all of it.
So really, the entire spectrum of human vulnerability is mediated by this one package.
That's exactly it.
From the moment you drop a toddler off at daycare to the moment someone is turning an elderly parent in a hospice bed, the human lifespan is managed by people trained under this specific set of codes.
That is the structural reality. And maintaining a curriculum of that scale requires an immense financial architecture.
Which the dossier calls the maintenance economy, right?
Yes, the maintenance economy. Because the CHC package doesn't just float in the ether.
Right. Someone has to write it.
Exactly. It is owned, maintained, and constantly updated by an entity called Human Ability Ltd.
Human ability.
Yes. They operate as a Jobs and Skills Council, which is an industry-led company established under the Commonwealth skills reforms.
And Human Ability isn't operating as a charity here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a massive financial engine driving this maintenance.
A huge one. The funding comes through a Commonwealth grant from the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations.
Which is commonly known as DEWR, right?
That's right, DEWR. And the forensic dossier is incredibly meticulous about the financial footprint here.
I noticed that. The author doesn't just throw out estimates.
No, not at all. It identifies the specific grant, which is Grant GA318667.
And the dollar amount is staggering.
It is. The exact proven dollar amount backing this maintenance is $54,549,093.87.
Over $54.5 million.
Yes, and that funding cycle runs from mid-2023 to mid-2028.
I want to pause on the surgical precision of that number, because the investigator had to execute a serious piece of forensic cleanup on the public record just to establish that baseline figure.
Oh, the cleanup is a fascinating testament to the rigor required when investigating bureaucracies.
Walk us through what happened there.
Well, prior to the publication of this dossier, an AI-generated report had been circulating.
Right, I remember seeing notes on this in the text.
Yeah, and this AI report had falsely inflated the grant to over $61.8 million.
How does an AI just invent an extra $7 million?
It had essentially hallucinated a fake legal amendment. It conflated the CHC grant data with an adjacent grant for digital skills.
Wow. Just mashed them together.
Exactly. So the investigator had to track down the actual Senate order primary documents to prove the AI's confabulation and establish the true figure.
Which is so crucial because precision is paramount in this kind of systemic critique.
It really is.
If an investigator gets one digit wrong in their financial reporting, the bureaucracy will use that tiny inaccuracy to dismiss the entire structural argument. They'll say, well, you don't even know the budget, so why should we listen to you?
Exactly. That's a classic bureaucratic defense mechanism.
So this proven $54.5 million is allocated, according to the department's own language, to keep the national care curriculum, quote, current and fit for purpose.
Right, that's the official mandate.
But if they are being paid $54.5 million to keep this curriculum fit for purpose, the obvious question becomes, whose purpose is it actually fit for?
That is the core question.
Because the dossier makes it abundantly clear that it is not fit for the millions of separated and adopted individuals moving through the system.
And measuring fitness for purpose in government is usually this really murky process, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Lots of vague metrics.
Yeah, it usually involves key performance indicators and internal self-assessments that rarely reflect actual lived realities.
But the investigator bypassed that entirely.
They did. Instead of relying on anecdotal complaints, they built a mechanism to actually score the erasure within the curriculum.
This brings us to the omission platform V2.2.1 audit featured in the dossier, which, by the way, building an auditing tool is a brilliant way to force a system to look at its own ghost.
It is so effective.
How exactly do the investigators structure this tool to score a training framework?
So the omission tool works by taking the actual endorsed training frameworks, the literal text of the CHC qualifications we mentioned earlier.
The actual syllabus.
Right. And it scores them against 8 distinct survivor-centered rights.
Okay, and where did these rights come from? Did they just make them up?
No, not at all. The investigator didn't invent these rights out of thin air. They are derived from international human rights standards that Australia has already formally ratified.
Okay, so these are legally recognized concepts. What are the 8 domains?
The domains include the continuity of identity, the integrity of family, cultural continuity, information rights, agency, consent, self-determination, and the preservation of memory.
The preservation of memory, that's powerful because these domains represent the exact specific things a human being loses when they are separated from their origin, and the bureaucratic record is sealed behind them.
Exactly.
So to evaluate the curriculum against the preservation of memory, for example, means asking if an aged care worker is taught how to handle a patient whose early memories don't align with their official file.
Precisely. If an elderly patient starts talking about a mother who isn't listed on their medical chart, is the worker trained to recognize that as a severed origin, or do they just assume it's dementia?
Wow. Yeah, that is a profoundly practical question for the care sector.
It is. So the investigator points the omission tool directly at the 3 foundational care qualifications: early childhood, aging support, and individual support, and extracts the data.
And what does the data show?
The results provide a quantifiable measure of the curriculum's failure to address severed origins.
The data is incredibly grim from what I read.
Very grim.
The system average across the 3 foundational qualifications was 24.5 out of 100.
Yeah, 24.5.
And 5 out of the 8 rights domains scored at a level deemed critical risk by the audit.
But the absolute lowest score, the finding that truly anchors the investigator's whole argument, is in the very first domain.
Identity continuity.
Yes, identity continuity. It came in at 12.6 out of 100.
12.6.
A score of 12.6 is a structural failure of massive proportions.
It really is.
It quantifies the exact depth of the blind spot we were talking about earlier.
Let's translate what a 12.6 actually means for a human body sitting in an intake room.
Right, bringing it back to the person.
Exactly. It means that the national training system produces practitioners who are fundamentally unequipped to recognize the most defining fact of an adopted person's life.
They just don't have the tools.
Right. The workforce is never taught that a person can be deprived of the knowledge of who they are, which means they certainly aren't taught that helping a person hold or recover that knowledge is a legitimate part of the job of caring for them.
And this reinforces the earlier point, the workforce is not unwilling to care.
Right. They aren't bad people.
No, they are untaught. The competency simply does not exist within the curriculum they are required to master.
What strikes me most about this is the uniformity of the failure.
How do you mean?
Well, if you saw a low score in one unit, say in one specific childcare qualification, you might just write that off as a drafting oversight.
Yeah, just a mistake.
Right. You could assume someone just missed a bullet point when they were updating the syllabus. But a critically low score across 3 distinct qualifications, across 8 distinct rights domains, spanning the entire human lifespan, that is not a typo.
No, it's systemic.
It is a property of the schema. It's like a contractor building a house and forgetting to put a front door on it.
Right.
If you do it once, you're just clumsy. But if you build 3 million identical houses across the entire country and none of them have front doors, that is no longer a mistake.
No, at that point, it is an architectural feature.
Exactly. The blueprint is executing exactly as intended.
And that structural analogy maps perfectly onto the concept of the architecture of silence, which is the theoretical core of the essay.
The architecture of silence.
Yes. To understand how systemic erasure functions, the text distinguishes between 2 different scales of silence.
Okay, let's break those down.
Well, in adoption and family separation, society is very accustomed to retail silence.
Retail silence being the locked filing cabinet, right?
Exactly.
It's the sealed adoption file, the redacted original birth certificate, the singular secret kept from one specific person by an agency or a judge.
Yes. It's retail because it is localized and specific to an individual transaction of secrecy.
It happens one by one.
Right. But the $54.5 million training package represents something entirely different. It represents the wholesale layer of silence.
Wholesale silence.
Yes. The essay argues that you don't need to suppress a question about a severed origin if the architecture of the system ensures the question is literally never asked in the first place.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You manufacture a 3 million strong workforce that is trained not to see it.
Exactly.
Wholesale erasure isn't written into a secret folder in a government basement. It is written into the accredited competencies of the people who manage our daily lives.
And the mechanism that allows this wholesale layer to function is what the text identifies as institutionalized non-adoptee bias.
Non-adoptee bias.
Yeah.
So how does that play out in the curriculum?
Well, this bias doesn't operate through explicit malice. There isn't a line in the textbook that says ignore adopted people.
Right. It's more subtle than that.
Much more. It operates as the unmarked baseline of the curriculum. The default assumption that preserving a person's origin isn't a necessary part of supporting their well-being doesn't need to be stated out loud.
It just functions entirely through absence.
Yes. It is bias operating at the level of determining what is even considered a valid question to ask in a care setting.
I think the most unsettling part of the systemic analysis here is the explanation for why this blankness is allowed to persist.
Yeah, the motivation behind it.
Exactly. If you look at it from the outside, you might ask why a care system would want its workers to be blind to a specific form of trauma.
It seems counterintuitive.
Right. But the dossier's answer is that a workforce trained not to see the wound is simply easier to run.
It's an administrative reality.
The blankness isn't a failure of the system. For the administrators, it's an efficiency.
Because the logistics of care, from an administrative standpoint, prioritize speed and standardization above all else.
They have to handle the volume.
Exactly. And the text argues that a worker who understands what was taken from a separated person is inherently a more complicated worker to manage.
How so?
Well, that worker asks harder questions during intake. They demand to keep better, more nuanced records. They might refuse to use standard, rigid forms that force a severed family tree into a neat binary box.
Right, because an adoptee's family tree rarely fits into the standard mother-father boxes on a hospital intake form.
Exactly. They slow down the machinery of care because they are insisting on human complexity.
And for the system, maintaining that blankness is highly efficient. It keeps the conveyor belt moving without interruption.
It does.
If the curriculum actually trained workers to see the wound, the system would have to allocate resources, time, and specialized processes to treat it.
Which costs money and time.
So by ensuring they never see it, the system just avoids the cost of complexity. The $54.5 million is an investment in maintaining a smooth, uninterrupted administrative surface.
That is a chilling way to look at it, but the dossier backs it up.
And the immediate question that arises for me is how a bureaucracy ensures that this massive blind spot never gets corrected.
Right, because things do get updated.
Exactly. These training packages don't just sit on a dusty shelf, they are constantly reviewed and updated. So how does an omission this large survive continuous cycles of review?
Well, the dossier provides a heavily documented case study that answers exactly that question. It explores the illusion of consultation.
The illusion of consultation. Tell us about the case study.
On September 3rd, 2024, a Commonwealth statutory workforce intelligence body called Jobs and Skills, Australia partnered with Human Ability.
Human Ability, the group that maintains the package.
Right, and they released a landmark report titled The Future of the Early Childhood Education Profession.
So this is a forward-looking capacity study.
Yes. It was designed to determine what the childhood workforce needs to be sustainable and skilled for the future.
And this wasn't just a minor internal memo, it was a massive undertaking.
Huge.
The scale of the study is laid out in the text. It resulted in 28 formal findings and 41 recommendations. The process was guided by a 37-member steering group of industry leaders, and it drew more than 50 public submissions.
And yet, the jaw-dropping finding from the omission dossier is that across all of those findings, recommendations, experts, and submissions, the question of whether an early childhood educator should be trained to understand a child's severed origin does not appear a single time.
Zero mentions.
Zero. It is entirely invisible in the most comprehensive examination of the workforce's future that the Commonwealth commissioned.
If I'm looking at this critically, I just have to ask how a 37-member steering group of highly educated experts misses this entirely.
It seems impossible, right?
It does. It's difficult to imagine dozens of professionals sitting in a room and consciously agreeing to ignore a human rights gap that scored a 12.6 out of 100 in an audit.
Well, the dossier anticipates that skepticism, and it argues that the answer is more structural than some sort of conscious conspiracy of individuals.
Okay, so it's not a smoky back room.
No, it's about how the machinery of consultation is built. The investigator points out that the consultation mechanisms themselves, the steering groups, the technical committees, the foundation membership structures of the Jobs and Skills Councils, they define the boundaries of what is considered a legitimate workforce need before the discussion even begins.
Oh, I see. They set the menu of acceptable topics before anyone even sits down at the table.
Exactly. The text asserts that adoption competency, identity continuity, and the lived expertise of separated people have simply never been allowed to cross that boundary into institutional legitimacy.
So the advocates who would have raised the issue weren't in the room because the structure didn't include a door for them to enter.
Exactly. The $54.5 million doesn't pay a censor to go through the document and delete references to adoption.
Right.
It simply maintains the pristine, hermetically sealed conditions where the omission is guaranteed to survive.
The curriculum is updated and kept current without ever being forced to actually open its eyes to the lived reality of the people moving through the system.
It's a closed loop.
And if this seems like a localized problem isolated to vocational childcare or aged care certificates, the dossier introduces the upward logic of the system to show how bureaucracies actually scale their blind spots.
Yes, the scaling is where it becomes a national crisis.
Right.
Because the danger of systemic erasure is that it doesn't stay confined to one level of governance. To understand how the erasure scales, the text tracks the career movement of Professor Barney Glover, AO.
And who is Professor Glover in this context?
Professor Glover was the commissioner at Jobs and Skills Australia who actually oversaw the very early childhood workforce study we just talked about, the one that completely missed the identity gap.
So he presided over the consultation that maintained the blind spot.
Yes, he did. And on June 30th, 2026, Professor Glover exited Jobs and Skills Australia and stepped directly into the chair of a newly created, highly influential body.
Which body is that?
It's called the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, or ATEC. He was appointed the inaugural chief commissioner for a 5-year term.
Okay, and what is ATEC's purpose?
ATEC was created to completely restructure Australian education through a mandate of harmonization.
Harmonization. That sounds very bureaucratic.
It is. Its goal is to break down the historical barriers between vocational training, like the CHC packages we've been discussing, and the higher education university sector, fusing them into a single, seamless tertiary system.
Wow. So the implications of that upward movement are honestly chilling.
They really are.
Because the training logic that scored a 12.6 in identity continuity, the logic that certified a workforce trained to be blank when faced with a severed origin, is now positioned at the steering wheel of the entire nation's tertiary education structure.
Exactly. A localized blind spot in a vocational curriculum is poised to become the architectural frame for the entire system.
Right. If the baseline standard for human identity is 12.6 out of 100, harmonizing the sectors means propagating that erasure across university nursing degrees, social work degrees, psychology, and beyond.
And the text really emphasizes that this scaling happens through continuity, not malice.
Right. Again, it's not a conspiracy.
No, there's no suggestion that the new chief commissioner intends to erase adoptees from the university sector. He simply brings the baseline assumptions of his previous agency to his new desk.
The institutional frameworks that didn't ask the question in the vocational sector are now designing the overarching structure for higher education.
So exactly, which brings us to a really critical juncture in the analysis.
Right. If a system is this fundamentally broken, and if it is producing harm on a national scale, basic logic suggests that someone must be held responsible.
You would think so.
If a corporation pollutes a river, you pursue the executives. If a bridge collapses, you investigate the engineers. When a national training framework actively erases the origins of millions of people, who owns the failure? Who do you call to fix it?
And this is where the investigators' attempt to hold this system to account reveals what the dossier calls the accountability gap.
The accountability gap.
Let's dig into that.
It is an absolute masterclass in bureaucratic evaporation. The text characterizes it as the 5 desks.
The 5 desks, okay.
When the investigator tried to demand a repair to the 12.6 score, they encountered a structure that is perfectly designed to diffuse responsibility.
Let's trace how that disconnect operates, because it's fascinating. If you are the investigator and you are holding an audit that proves a critical failure, your first stop is the entity that actually writes the package human ability.
Right. You go to their desk and present the data.
And what do they say? When confronted, Human Ability's structural defense is that they merely developed the curriculum to meet the standards set by the ministers. They inherited the foundational architecture of the package from previous skills councils.
So they pass the buck.
Exactly. Their position is that they didn't invent the omission, they just maintained the framework they were given.
So the developer claims they're just following orders. The logical next step is to follow the money. You go to the second desk, the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, DUWR.
The ones funding it.
Right. They are the ones paying $54.5 million to keep the package fit for purpose. So you demand they mandate a fix.
And DWR's administrative defense is that they merely fund the council and facilitate the endorsement of the packages through the ministers.
Okay.
They act as an administrative conduit, not curriculum designers. They argue that they do not write the specific units of competency, and therefore, the issue must be taken up with the developers.
The classic pass the buck loop. The funder points back to the developer. So you move to the third desk, Jobs and Skills Australia, the intelligence body that just ran a massive capacity study on the workforce. You ask them why their multi-million-dollar study failed to flag the absence of adoption competency.
And JSA defends its omission by citing its terms of reference. They argue they were tasked with studying workforce capacity, meaning how to recruit and retain workers, not human rights or specific pedagogical competencies.
So the gap in identity continuity fell outside the strict boundaries of their mandate.
Precisely. The terms of reference define the blindness.
Okay, so moving on to the fourth desk, you approach the Australian Skills Quality Authority, ASQA. They are the national regulator. I mean, they have quality authority right there in their name.
Right, they regulate the system.
So you present the 12.6 score and ask them to regulate the package.
But ASQA's defense relies on the strict limits of its regulatory power. They police the delivery of the training by registered training organizations. They ensure that teachers are qualified, that exams are administered properly. However, they do not regulate the content of the curriculum itself. The content belongs to the Jobs and Skills Council.
It is an absolute hall of mirrors. You are left with the final desk, the ultimate failsafe for vulnerable people, which is the National Children's Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission.
The last resort.
Exactly. You take the evidence of wholesale erasure of children's origins to the commissioner.
And the commissioner has the power to receive a systemic finding. She can research the issue, publish a comprehensive report, and advise the relevant minister.
But what can she actually change?
That's the catch. Under her statutory powers, she cannot legally compel a single word of a single unit in that training package to change. Her power is entirely advisory.
So the genius of this distributed design failure is that because no single body owns the entire omission, no single body is obliged to repair it.
Exactly. It's perfectly fragmented.
The developer points to the funder points to the developer, the regulator points to the limits of its mandate, the intelligence body hides behind its terms of reference, and the Human Rights Commissioner has no enforcement mechanism.
It's an impregnable loop.
The silence isn't a locked door guarded by one person holding a key. It is maintained by everyone, and therefore it is legally maintained by absolutely no one.
Right.
The erasure simply floats in the bureaucratic ether, undermining the care of millions, while the $54.5 million continues to flow.
It is designed to be a loop of unaccountability. But what makes this investigation so compelling is the tactical action the author took to combat that exact loop.
Yes, the lodgement strategy.
Right. They didn't just document the evaporation of responsibility. They designed an intervention to trap the bureaucracy.
On June 30th, 2026, that was the exact day Barney Glover exited JSA for his new role.
Exactly. On that exact day, the investigator lodged the omission audit to all 5 desks simultaneously.
To all of them at once.
Yes. By lodging the documented 12.6 finding with the council, the department, the workforce authority, the regulator, and the commissioner on the exact same day, the investigator effectively neutralized the hall of mirrors.
You completely remove their ability to pass the buck in the dark.
You force them to know that the other 4 desks are holding the exact same document.
That's brilliant.
The developer can't claim ignorance if they know the funder and the regulator are staring at the same audit. The investigator forced the omission into the official collective record.
And that coordinated lodgement really sets the stage for the final analysis of the dossier.
Moving away from diagnosing the systemic failure and toward the open window for reform.
Right, because the text insists on a post-tragic framework.
Which means it is entirely clear-eyed about the depth of the harm.
Yes, it doesn't minimize the pain or the subsonic hum.
Exactly, but it refuses to accept that the architecture is unchangeable.
Because bureaucracies notoriously defend the status quo by arguing that systemic change is too expensive.
Oh, always. They claim it requires a decade of task forces or a royal commission to overhaul a curriculum.
It's always framed as impossibly hard.
But the dossier preemptively dismantles that defense by analyzing the actual cost of fixing this specific gap.
Because the structural fix is incredibly cheap.
It really is.
The dossier points out that repairing a 12.6 score in identity continuity doesn't require building a new hospital or launching a new federal agency.
No, it simply requires a competency.
It requires adding a handful of specific units to a curriculum. It's teaching the person in the childhood room or the worker at the bedside that the official file isn't always neutral.
Right.
And that helping someone hold the knowledge of who they are is a fundamental part of the job. It is literally a few pages of text and the political will to endorse them.
And when you measure the administrative cost of adding those units against the $54,549,000 that DDWR is already paying per cycle to update the package,
The cost of reform doesn't even register as a rounding error.
it's completely negligible financially. The barrier to fixing the omission is not financial. The text argues it is entirely a matter of institutional will.
The reason it hasn't been done is because a blank workforce is easier to run.
Exactly.
But the dossier reveals an urgent, real-time reality for anyone listening to this deep dive right now.
And this is the most critical takeaway.
It is. We are not discussing abstract history. The system is currently sitting in an open window.
The specific early childhood qualification we talked about, CHC 30121, the credential that scored a 22.8 overall and a 12.6 in identity continuity.
Right, the early childhood one.
That package is under active review at this exact moment. The revised version of that credential is scheduled to be finalized and endorsed by the skills ministers in mid-2026.
So that means the framework dictating how early childhood educators will handle severed origins for the next decade is a live, unlocked document.
It is sitting open on a developer's screen at Human Ability right now. Every unit that goes in and every unit that is left out is a choice being made in real time. For a brief window of weeks, this gap is not a permanent law of physics.
It is an open question.
It is incredibly rare to catch an entrenched bureaucracy in a moment where naming the problem and renewing the problem are both simultaneously possible.
The erasure that was taught to millions of workers can be untaught, provided the choice is acknowledged.
The blankness was always a choice, dressed up as an accident.
But the dossier has costed the accident. The 12.6 has been measured, the choice is visible, and it is sitting on the desks of the people whose names are on the funding line.
The system can no longer claim ignorance.
Which fundamentally shifts the leverage for advocates and policymakers. Understanding the mechanics of the omission, exactly as laid out in the investigation, is the prerequisite for refusing to accept it.
If you want to see the network graphs and the machinery of the system for yourself, we highly recommend reading the full essay Certificate Third in Forgetting You and really exploring the forensic dossier.
It's essential reading, because once you understand how an architecture of silence is constructed, you realize exactly where to start dismantling it.
You see the exact leverage points.
We started this deep dive by talking about the X-ray machine and how comforting it is when a system can cleanly see what is broken.
Right.
But today, we've examined the blueprint of a system that is highly funded, meticulously governed, and precisely trained to look right through the missing center of a person's life.
It's profound.
So you have to ask yourself, if they can spend $54.5 million to look right past a severed origin, what other fundamental human truths are we paying millions of dollars to actively unsee?